Welcome, everyone. We are so glad to be back again with many of you who joined us for the first session in the series. And we are welcoming all those new participants to our second session of the speaker series entitled Cultural, Spiritual, and Trauma Awareness: How People from Different Faiths and Cultures Approach Grief. The 5-part series is hosted by LifePath and the Community Hospice in partnership with the Albany Guardian Society, and it's been an exciting endeavor aimed to help us better understand our emotions as a part of life and love. Felicia and I, Felicia from LifePath and myself from the Community Hospice, are your moderators, and we welcome a wonderful panel of our speakers today. A couple of housekeeping items. You will be muted, and we ask that your camera be off. We invite you to use the chat box for any questions that may come up throughout the presentation, and there will be time for our panel to respond to questions at the end of the presentation. However, if something's applicable to the topic at hand, Felicia or I may pose it to the panelists as appropriate. There's the slide that is available will not be made available to attendees, and this presentation will be recorded and posted to the LifePath website for you to listen again or to share with friends. And the link to the recording should be available in the upcoming weeks. I will turn the mic over to Felicia to introduce our speakers so that we can get started with the presentation, and thank you again for joining us today. We hope you'll consider joining us for the rest of the series in the coming weeks. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. So one of our first speakers today is Doug Burleigh, who is an ordained minister with the Free Methodist Church and began his ministry in 1978. He holds a Bachelor's of Science from Houghton College and a Master's in Divinity from Asbury Theological Seminary in Wilmer, Kentucky. Following various clinical experiences, Doug has worked as a chaplain in healthcare settings since 1988, and he is currently serving as the chaplain at the Community Hospice with the nursing home team. Our second speaker is Dr. Robert Miller, Jr., who is a tenured associate professor at the University at Albany in the School of Social Welfare. Dr. Miller has earned his doctorate and Master of Philosophy degrees from Columbia University and a Master's of Social Work from the University of Pennsylvania. As a qualitative methodologist, his research program integrates the intersection of HIV disease, sexual minorities, and spirituality. Dr. Miller is well published, contributing in many ways to various journals and papers, and for the past 12 years, he has served as the director of the United States and African Partnership to Build Stronger Communities. Our next speaker, although was not originally on the advertisements that you all may have gotten, but we are very thankful to have him, is Rabbi Monson. He is the Jewish Community Chaplain of Jewish Family Services of Northeastern New York, who served the Daughters of Sarah community in June earlier this year, following his rabbinic ordination from the Academy of the Jewish Religion in May of 2021. Previously, Rabbi Ami served as the Director of Youth Engagement and Rabbinic Intern at the Valley Beth Shalom in Los Angeles, California. Rabbi Ami holds 3 master's degrees from Gratz College in Jewish Education, Jewish Communal Service, and Jewish Studies. And last but certainly not least is Tanya Schwartz, who is the Albany Regional Director of Care Managed for All. She is a graduate of the dual degree program at the University at Albany School of Social Welfare, where she received a degree in social work, and at Binghamton University, she earned a master's degree in social science. Throughout her extensive social work career, Tanya has provided services in the areas of psychotherapy, case management, community development, advocacy, education, and geriatric care management. She also has shared her extensive knowledge in the areas of behavioral health, family dynamics, Alzheimer's and related dementias, healthcare transitions, as well as palliative care and geriatric care. And with that, I will pass it off to our speakers today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to take the lead. We're going to set it up in a conversational way of a panel. We're going to start with Dr. Miller, setting up a stage of what it means, what does death mean and its universality and things like that. And then we're going to go into a case study with some questions to guide us to enhance our learning and to be able to ask even more questions to discuss this incredible topic. So with that, thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Miller, take it away.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. So this idea, what does death mean? I think we have all lived enough life to understand what it does and does not mean. But I think the question becomes, how do we think about it in a generative way? So as providers, we think about it in terms of, if we are in bereavement, we are dealing with a multi-client system. So on the one hand, we have the person who is actually transitioning. And part of our work and our focus is both to be, for them, a coach as well as a witness. We'll hear later around what does it mean to be entrusted with stories, to carry on, to help the person's legacy carry on. The other work is around, how do we inspire hope in this moment? How do we get those who remain to be really mindful and intentional about choosing life? Because as life continues, tomorrow is another day. And our work then becomes, how do we best live out in the both bearing witness to the memory of the one who has left, as well as how do we make a meaningful life in the aftermath of that. In thinking about this notion of death, death is an odd kind of thing in that it has different meanings at the same time, depending upon the circumstance. So how we react to a sudden death is one set of conversations, and it becomes tragic and awful and all those other kinds of things. If a person is lingering, it becomes a different set of conversations. And one might even argue that there is a blessing in the release of life in that way. There are also conversations related to what is complicated grief, as opposed to what's unresolved. And I think I'll stop after this. And I think the biggest question is going to be, how do we both as providers, as well as those who are walking the path, how do we ascribe meaning to this process? And what do we do as those who remain, both for ourselves and for those around us who are grieving? How do we inspire hope? And how do we, as intentional providers, think clearly around right-sizing all of this? So Donna's case is fascinating in that it brings up several conversations and several questions. And so with that, I'll just stop and let's have the conversations around Donna and her family.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Next slide, please. We're going to present you with a case study. And I'm going to read it to you. And please keep it in mind when we discuss the questions. Donna and James are an interracial couple and have been together for several decades. They have a close relationship with their 3 adult children. 2 daughters live locally with their families, and their son is out on the West Coast. Donna had experienced trauma during her childhood. James come a more stable and loving family. Donna had recently been diagnosed with a terminal illness, and hospice consultation was arranged. Question number 1. How would you begin working with Donna and family? how would you address the couple, Donna herself, and her children? And we're going to start with Doug.
To begin to work with a family like Donna and James, for me, requires a lot of understanding who they are as people. You know, what is Donna's educational background? What is her work history? And the same for James. So I'm trying to build a foundation of history there, so that I can build a relationship and begin to explore with them, as Dr. Miller said, you know, where is hope found for them? And that can involve understanding the things that inspire hope for them in terms of life and interest, and certainly their faith, and where faith is found for them as a, you know, in that, you know, what kind of a relationship do they have with their children? How close are they, not just physically, but emotionally? What about their son who's on the West Coast? So there's a lot of history building that goes on in that, you know, in that time. And becoming aware of their, you know, of their faith background, and how does their faith interact, you know, in a culturally diverse family, you know, in that regard. So lots of history, lots of interacting, lots of getting to know them, lots of letting them tell me their story in terms of family, in terms of life, in terms of faith, in that regard.
Thank you, Doug. Rabbi Ami, if Donna and James came to you, how would you assess them? How would you begin working with them?
Well, I definitely start with what Doug said. I think just getting their story, their background, but you know, what their religious faiths are, you know, what their ties to the divine are. If they have a tie to the divine, are they churchgoers? Are they synagogue goers? I know it's an interracial couple, but perhaps they're also an interfaith couple. That's also certainly a possibility. And I think it would be actually really important if there's whether there's a good or a bad relationship. I would actually, first and foremost, as soon as the diagnosis came and assess this Donna's situation, I would actually have the child from the West Coast come in. And if for some reason the child was not available, I would actually try to have a one-on-one on Zoom with the child and family, if he has a family or she has a family in the West Coast, because it's one of the things that's really important is that the whole family is involved in the situation, unless there are really severe issues of a breakdown in familial relationship. I think it's important that Donna has as much support as possible. And if that child down the West Coast is, you know, has been such a source of, you know, I don't want to say loss, but missing that child, and maybe their children involved, you want to bring, that's going to make her feel whole in a time when she's really feeling, you know, broken. And I think that's important. I think to talk to Donna and James separately is very important, but then I would actually have talked to the children separately, and then maybe even have a third conversation with them as a whole. But most important is that I want to just be present. I want to, my approach would be to have lead questions, but really to listen as much as possible. And really most important is to get, what's Donna feeling? What she, you know, how does she feel about what she's going through now, what she's going to be going through? And if from the background of the case study is, you know, is it possible that, you know, her background, she feels a continuous situation where things haven't gone well for her. You know, what, I mean, I'll get into it later in one of the other questions, but the sort of why me question, why is this happening to me, which I think is really important, because I think that comes up a lot, is the why me. And the most important is to create the most comforting and soothing atmosphere, but also I think the best word I can use is safety. You wanted to make it a safe environment. If Donna needs to cry, let her cry. If the kids need to cry, if James needs to show emotion, maybe he's not an emotional person, but in this case, this has brought out other emotions. I want to make a safe space for that to happen.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Miller.
So this is going to be a fun role because I just get to surmise what everybody else has already said, all the genius that has already been presented. There are a couple of things I want to say here. So I'm not quite sure who's in the audience, but I really do encourage you to listen to us carefully. If you were in your grieving process, be mindful of that and give yourself space and time in that. And quite frankly, I'd also encourage you just to think about if you have an experience of hospice, whether it's good or bad, keep that in your thought as well. Because I think ultimately when we get to the place where we can have questions and answers, I, for one, am very open to being taught. And so I think our panelists too would love to hear what has been helpful for you as well as what's been challenging. The couple of things that were said that I think are really in play. One, for those providers in the room, understand who you are and what your role is for that, right? And understand both yourself as a witness bearer as well as coach. I'd also suggest that, again, and as I've said already, while Donna is a primary client, it's a family system. So you have multiple clients in that system. And so all of the stories are essential for this. This idea where meaning and purpose show up is important. And it is an interesting conversation. Again, I will say this a couple of times. One of the questions has to be, as they can get to it, what does this mean for each of them? And the last thing I'll say about this is, because Donna has had some trauma, be sure and again, this is for everyone, be sure that you lead with a question as opposed to an assumption, because Donna may have done all her trauma work and is ready to go, right? But we don't know that until we ask the question. In the same way, whatever might be unresolved for the rest of the family, being able to be witness bearer to some of that and to potentially bring resolution to that may be a goal within this process. Thanks.
Thanks, Dr. Miller. Very good. Let's go on. We've touched upon a lot of topics and there's a lot more we can go on to, but let's see if there's a difference if Donna were in a skilled nursing setting versus her home environment. And we will start with Rabbi Rami because this is something that he has discussed with us.
Thank you. I think that they are very different in terms of there may be more of a comfort level, and Donna may be more open to talking, or the family may be more open to talking if visiting them in their home. There's sometimes it's very hard in my experience, for residents to call the place like a nursing home or assisted living as home. And we have to be honest, and I'm not trying to be harsh in any way, but we don't look at a home as our place of where we're going to pass over to the other life. But in a institution, unfortunately, I think that's one of the things that is always in the mind of a resident or patient, is that this may be the last place that they live. This might be the last place where they are going to exist. So it may be a little harder for someone to go into a skilled nursing center place and create that, what I would call, home environment. I think one of the things you can do, Jewishly, what I think has been put in place that I think are really important are two main things during this type of situation. One is the rabbis have created a situation, a thing called a vidui. A vidui is a confession. It's before you know that when you know that the end is near. If you get that opportunity to know that the end is near, the rabbis ask for the person who's in that unfortunate situation to is there anything they want to get off their chest? Is there anything they want to open up about, to talk about, to apologize to someone, maybe someone who's not even alive anymore, or to talk about something that has been weighing on their shoulders for so many years that they just, so there's a sense of peace before they enter the next life, that they feel a sense of they're not going into that next life with any kind of burden on their head, their shoulders, etc. And I think vidui is confession, and I think it's a very important and healing process. The other one that has been that I've actually had as an assignment, which is a little awkward, but I had as an assignment in rabbinical school, was creating an ethical will. Ethical wills are really interesting in terms of what would it's basically a document where you're writing, you basically ask the person, I would ask Donna, are there things that you want to make sure that are passed down to your children and to the future? These are the things I did. These are the values I hold, the ethics and values and morals I hold strongest to me, that I want to pass down to the generation. These are my favorite songs. These are my favorite quotes. These are, this is who I live by. If it's a beautiful quote by Maya Angelou, or I happen to be a huge Bob Marley fan, and so I put in my thing that Bob Marley music is important to me because it's about unity and peace and being a family, and just those things, or that education, that I want my children to have not only an education but Jewish education, all those kinds of things. An ethical will can be, I really kind of hate to use this word, but I'm going to. It can be very therapeutic. It can be very, it's a way to put down on paper what you don't realize you want to say before you pass on, and you get that opportunity. It's in writing, and you get to document it, and your family can see it, and make sure to save it, of course, by the way. But that you save it and send it, or Donna gives it to James and says, when I pass on, give this to my children, and I hope that it's passed down from generation to generation.
Thank you, Rabbi Ami. Doug, have you had any examples of and the differences of working with families like that?
My work with hospice is predominantly with nursing home folk. And there is quite a spectrum there in terms of caring for someone who's in a nursing home. And some of the factors that fit into that is, why are they there? How recent is their admission to the nursing home, and what is their cognitive function in terms of their ability my ability to interact with them in that regard. If someone has been in a nursing home for a long time, it becomes something of a home for them. This is their familiar place, and the residents around it become a second family. So there's a dynamic there. If it's a fairly recent admission to nursing home, you're dealing with another tier, another layer of loss that needs to be addressed because they have moved out of their own home into unfamiliar territory. So that becomes part of the dynamic that is there. And then there is certainly the cognitive function dimension. Why was Donna admitted to the nursing home? To go back to our example, is it because family is no longer physically able to care for her? Is it because her mental status is changed such that she needs to be in a safe environment? Lots of layers there that need to be understood. And yet, what I find a lot of times is that even for the folks who are significantly impaired because of their declined mental status, there can be a point of contact that you can enter into their world. And we're going to go back to the word hope, give them hope and peace and comfort. It may be listening to 50s music or 60s music or Elvis. It may be saying familiar prayers. I've had any number of occasions where I have begun to say the prayers of a Catholic faith because that's where that person is grounded. And they couldn't tell you what they had for lunch or, what day of the week it is, but they're able to say the Our Father with me or recite Psalm 23 with me. And it grounds them in a moment of hopefulness, of peacefulness, even when everything else has gone sideways for them. So sometimes the work in and around nursing home really is the work of finding that point of connection. I was once asked to come up with some single word answers to the difference between nursing home, home care, and hospital. And the word that I came across for nursing home work is the word custodian. Not the person who sweeps the floor and that, but the person who cares for and keeps and preserves the dignity and individuality and personality of the individual through finding that moment of connection, be it a faith connection, be it a history connection, be it a life connection, and also helping to maintain the family's part in that. Don is in the nursing home, but what about James and how is he doing with being in the, with his wife being in the nursing home? How are the children doing with mom being in the nursing home? All of that plays into that and involves individual and multiple layer conversations.
Thank you. Dr. Miller, how does culture dynamics play out here?
So before I get to culture, well, let's do culture and then we'll go to the other parts. I think certainly it is this understanding about what does death mean? And when I first said that, I hadn't thought about what I'm thinking about right now. And that is death something to be feared, or is death that transition that allows us to go to our loved ones? And so there is this whole conversation, and people have done this work already. Understand, if you've been around certain families, you'll be in rooms where the one who is actively transitioning is having conversations. One might argue that they're hallucinating. One might argue that they're talking to the people who are on the side, who are there to welcome them in. So, and I think for us to be mindful of that, all those things are culture. And I think to answer the question more broadly, I want to talk a little bit around psych terms. And so this psychological terms. So there's this thing called object relations. And the question gets at what are the transitional objects from home that can make the nursing home or the hospital feel more familiar? So what does it mean to have their pillows there? What does it mean to have their blankets there? What does it mean for them to be able to have some semblance of the familiar as they're embracing this really new and and I don't mean to be glib about this in the least. And at the time, I don't know that I could have understood it emotionally. But when my father died and we had in-home hospice, there was this conversation around, could he talk about what his impending death was? And my father couldn't. My mother, on the other hand, and I've had lots of conversations related to that. So again, this idea of meaning making and how people are able to tell their stories not for the sake of unburdening themselves per se. I mean, obviously that's a piece of it, but ultimately, and then to this point of, because tomorrow's coming. And so the work becomes, how do we help today in the beginning of the resolution of the grief journey? And so this idea of ethical wills makes perfect sense, right? So you're asking people to give what they want to be remembered. And it also allows for people to, you know what, I can take this piece of her with me. And also allows for the resolution, again, for the rest of the family. Last thing I've done around that. The difference between dying at home and dying in a facility, I think for the providers to check out what the assumptions are, and can people, just to understand what the location means for the person. And if for whatever reason there is some disenchantment with having them in a nursing home, but that is the most viable option, as a provider, being able to check in so that they can make peace with that. I'll stop there.
You have another minute. You wanted to talk about guilt?
Well, so listen, I mean, you know, as a good practicing Catholic who was both Baptist and AME, guilt has a little bit of utility sometimes, but not much often. I think at the end of the day, and I will say what I want to reiterate what I've already said. One, for the providers in the room to really understand, first of all, check what your assumptions are about what death means. Also understand yourself as both the witness and the coach. Because I think at the end, you're serving multiple roles to the multiple players who are in that family system, and they're all going to need all of those in varying degrees. And so, and to the extent that you can be, I don't use this term often, but either bicultural or multicultural in the same way that one is bilingual, being able to understand that though you may have certain beliefs around what death rituals are and certain beliefs in culture, understandings and aspirations of what death means in from your framework and your history, the real work is, how do you get them to tell you what it is for them so that you can help orchestrate, or at the very least be the, and this just came to me, the tour guide as they walk through this process. I'm done.
Before Rabbi gets,
okay. Go ahead, Doug.
Okay, before Rabbi speaks to this question, there are not only are there ethical wills, and I love that term, Rabbi, but I think there are, let me use the term ethical objects that may be very important to, particularly to someone's in a nursing home, but it can also be true in a home. You know, you walk into a home and you're going to see certain things there. And why are those things in that home? Or why are those things in the nursing home room? You know, what clues do they tell you about the individual? Or the other question is, what ethical things need to be brought to the room for, you know, in a nursing home to help the individual and to help the family, you know, in this time? You know, are there pictures? Are there icons? Are there you know, objects? And they're also helpful for providers because they can be triggers for conversation or triggers for memory. You know, you sit and you hold a picture to someone so they can see it, and they can tell you, maybe they can tell you a story about that picture or the people in that picture. So it's not just, you know, the ethical will of, I need this to be preserved, but it's the ethical will of this object.
Thank you. Thank you for expanding on it. That's very true. Rabbi Ami, could you give us an example of being an empathetic witness? I'm sure you have lots of them. How do you show up?
Well, it was interesting. I think one of the most profound experiences actually happened when my mom passed away. Before the week before she passed away, I'd come in from California, say about 5 days before she passed, and it was actually the example of a colleague of mine, which then if you want to say I stole it, I stole the idea and did it for someone else, and it really was very, very profound, which is it should be the most obvious thing, but it's not, and that is music, singing. When my brother and I were sitting in the room with my mom and we could not communicate with her, music, I felt very strongly that when this woman had come in, who was a friend of my brother's, and she was a CP trained, she came in and she sang to my mom some very familiar Jewish tunes, and I found myself perking up, and I was like, wow, what an incredible tool to be sympathetic and empathetic. And then and that was just with my brother and I. When I then went back to California, and a year later, one of my congregants who I was friendly with, I went to visit him in the hospital, and the family, wife, children, even grandchildren were in the room. I started singing some familiar Jewish tunes, and I could see he wasn't really reacting until I actually started to sing, and you could see him kind of moving his hands or moving his legs or whatnot, and you could tell that it was impactful. But not only, and I think Dr. Miller really spoke about this before, was it just didn't impact the patient or the resident, it impacted the entire family. I found the emotions coming out of the family, either a couple of them started singing with me, or a couple, to be honest, started having tears in their eyes because, and then telling me and letting me know what their loved one's favorite Jewish song was, or Jewish prayer. And I think that was a very moving experience. And I've seen it now on many occasions where song and music can really be the tool to connect with the family without words. You don't even need words, or I mean, if it's Hebrew words, if it's a different language, music is really universal. It's a great universal tool to use in all kinds of ways. I've actually used it a lot with early Alzheimer's and dementia patients who you can't really communicate with, but when you start to sing, they start to tap, and they start to, sort of hum their own lullaby.
That's lovely.
Yeah. And the other thing I was just going to say was, I think that just acknowledging that you're listening. In Judaism, in the ethics of the fathers, it says, "And more me'at v'aseh harbe," say little and do much. And it's kind of one of the things that I really guide myself by, is I don't have to say a lot. I just have to be present. I think when we were preparing for this, Dr. Miller and Doug and I all really came together. The one thing we totally agreed on was just being present, literally just walking in the room and knowing that family knows that they have someone as a support who cares and can be comforting, honestly, is half the battle. UCLA did a study years ago where 83% of listening was not, had nothing to do with talking or anything like that. It was just being present and sitting there. And I think whatever the other percentage was about actually saying a few words. So I think that's really the comforting way of being present, and also the family knowing that you're there. And then also continuous. I think it's also, if it's a one-stop shop and you're coming once, that's one thing. It's nice. I mean, if it's once and that person passes away, that's one thing. But if you are present there more than once, and at times that might also not be your time, there's a difference between your time and their time. And if you're, if I'm coming in, my first thing I do when I come in the morning at, let's say, 8 o'clock, which is before hours, quote unquote, for some people, if I come at 8 o'clock and the first thing I do is go to that family, and I'm there present with them while their loved one is sitting right in front of them in their last days, possibly, they know that I care. But if I'm coming in at 12 o'clock, I was like, well, I'm off at lunch and I thought I'd come by, not that it's wrong, but there is a difference. The family knows. They knows when they really, you don't be naive. They know when you care and when you don't, and when you're doing it sort of as, well, this is my job. It's not your job. It's part of who you are as a person. And I think for the, Dr. Miller addressed this before, that know who you are. Know who you are as a provider, as a coach, as a tour guide, that you're there to be present and to be as comforting as possible.
Thank you. Dr. Miller, you talked about holding the story before, and the story being a parting gift.
So can I put, Doug, this is your exemplar. And so this inspired me. We talked about this last week. So can you talk about that a bit? Because it was just beautiful to me.
Doug, last week you talked about.
Do you remember the story? do you remember the reference?
Oh, I believe I do. I was thinking, the one I'm thinking about is the one that happened last week, and we talked about it when we were getting ready.
Yeah, that, please, if you would. I just think that puts it in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm.
I agree.
Yeah. Very quickly, one of the folks that I take care of is an elderly woman. She is at best an agnostic. Long history there of that. And it was sitting with her last week, and she began to tell me stories of, she started with the fact that her family was closing her house, or the family's cabin up in the Adirondacks.
Yeah.
And then she said, they're closing my apartment up. And she began to talk about her loss of that. And she began to talk again about this sense of the closing of her life. And all of a sudden she stops and she takes a hold of my hand. And this is a woman who has not really wanted prayer. She reaches over to me and she says, pray that we have one more visit. Pray that we have one more visit. And that one, I still feel the shivers of that when I say that. But it was one of those, layers of conversation. I know she would never have said that at the first conversation, but being present with her as she has talked about her life over several conversations led her to that point where she could say that. And I think that's the important thing. It's saying little, doing much, saying little, listening lots, saying little, letting them set the agenda, saying little, let them say, this is what I need in the midst of all of this stuff that's going on, that's swirling around me.
That's really powerful.
So there are a couple of things here. One, I thought you were going to tell a different story, Doug, because the one it occurred to me while you were telling that story. It was the soldier.
Oh, okay. That's another one. Another one that involves multiple layers. Let me see if I can tell that one quickly. Elderly World War II vet. He survived multiple layers of intense combat. His company was one of the first companies that landed on D-Day, and they landed at one of the worst of the fighting centers on the D-Day beaches in Omaha. Survived that without a scratch. He went from there and survived the Battle of the Bulge without a scratch. And he talks about the trauma of being in, combat situations and how powerful they were. Talked about another firefight that he was in and he said, the thing that almost cost me my faith was being the guard to the documentary photographer because his company was one of the first ones that went into one of the German prisoner of war camps, and seeing, standing there while they were documenting what he described as living skeletons. The folks who had been in the concentration camp and had been just physically reduced to little more than skin and bones. And he said, Doug, that was the thing that cost me my faith at its deepest roots. And we talked about that for a long time. I was driving home one day and I got a phone call. And it was from his daughter. And she said to me, Doug, what are you and Dad talking about? I wish I could tell you all the stories. He's asked me to keep some of it personal and private and sacred. And it is sacred ground. It's not holy ground that you walk on when you're listening to these stories.
Come on, Doug.
It's sacred because it's so close to their hearts and their lives.
That's good.
And she said, maybe I really don't need to know what you're talking about. But whatever it is, keep it up. I see a change in Dad. He is less anxious. He's less frightful. He's less scared. He's more at peace than I've ever seen him. Whatever it is you're talking about, keep doing it.
That's hot. 3 statements and I'm done. One, Doug, I'm grateful for that story again. Like I said, it was last week and I still keep it. It was like, I'll say it again, like I said last week, you did good. What both of you talked about is what I lovingly refer to as either the intentional witness, engaging in what I lovingly call the ministry of presence. And in both instances, that idea of coming at the 8 o'clock moment just to check in and say good morning, that's an intentionality. And people remember that. And I guess what I would also say, particularly to the people who are listening, and for those of you, again, who are walking through, the story was there may some of you be walking through your own brief moments. To the extent that you can formulate your thoughts to suggest what worked for you, should hospice be a thing, to be able to share those ideas, because again, all of us are here about the healing moment, right? And all of us are here about the notions of meaning making and purpose. And this is what all that work is. The only reason why you're doing the ministry of presence is to help the multi-client system make sense of something that is borderline unimaginable, right? And to be able to help them to answer the question, what am I going to do when they leave? Tanya, you're up.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Miller. Could you go into question 4, given what you just said? What are the assumptions about Donna's trauma? How does it affect us as providers, volunteers?
So when that one showed up for me, what I was really struck by is, again, so social workers talk about a strengths perspective as opposed to working from a deficit model. And when we hear trauma and we hear that she's a trauma survivor, it is an interesting question related to whether or not we actually believe the phrase trauma survivor, right? So when we talk about it, I think the unspoken assumption is they may have survived it, but they're still lingering in their spirit or in their body or in their milieu, whatever you want to call that. I'm just asking for us to be really intentional and check in. Because we may be all about, she went through this, she went through the other, blah, 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 blah. And to Rabbi's assumption or assertion, why me? As opposed to, with respect, been there, done that, got the t-shirt. Now, I just want to make sure I'm taking care of my kids, and my kids understand that they have the strength that I have to walk through the things I walk through. And again, the point is you need to check in so that you understand what you're looking at, right? So that becomes the first thing around that. And again, so whatever, once we're checking in, so second argument, let's go to the more challenging place, that there's still some unresolved issue around some of the difficulties that they've walked through. You know, if you're intentional about this, I believe Spirit speaks, and I'm just gonna say that because I mean it. And so the right questions, if you're in a line with your purpose and your role, the questions will come for revelation to be offered. And so one of the questions simply, if she is able to talk about those things, a question around what do you need for the resolution of that event? And the reality is you may not be able to get it, but at least you've asked the question. That means you've been able to connect with her, right? And in the same way, if those traumas are family-wide, being able to pose those questions as well so that you get the most robust canvas of that moment as possible. And again, and then you might not, and again, for her, she may need to, and here we go, she may need to take that to the grave, unresolved. She may. Let us hope that the business of life can be done before she walks up to the next space, but you know, it is what it is. But again, if we're actually thinking about this notion of multi-client system and tomorrow does come, for those for whom it does, they too need to be able to think through how do they get resolution with those things, right? Because there's grief, and then I don't know if we've actually talked about it yet, but then there's complicated grief, right? And this idea about complicated grief is the multi-layers of unresolved stuff in the midst of a loss. And once the loss has occurred, unless you get answers, you're not going to get them. Do you see what I'm saying here? And so the work becomes, how do you help the family do what they need to do to have their finished business?
Thank you. Rabbi Ami?
One of the things I would say, the last thing that Dr. Miller said is, that's why I think the rabbis really put in this whole thing with vidui, the confession, really opens up that whole category. I mean, usually it's between the pastor, the person, you know, the rabbi, the priest, whomever, or well, in this case, obviously the rabbi and the resident or patient, and it's a one-on-one. But it is possible, you could possibly, if the patient was open to it, to have an open confession with the family if there are things that they have to get off their chest, and that way everybody can, it's a step in dying peacefully, which I think is really important. The other thing I want to say, which you addressed at the beginning, is I think I wanted to wait till this question, so now it's here, is assuming that Donna is a good person and had this trauma early on, and now and we don't have ages in here, which I think does play a part in a little bit, is if she's dying at, let's say, what I wouldn't call an old age for someone, which age is an interesting determination. I have to be very careful what I say. Be very careful what I've said. Is something that happens to me a lot, especially working with patients or residents who are Holocaust survivors, is the question comes up often: why me? Why do bad things happen to good people? There's a wonderful, incredible book by Rabbi Harold Kushner about this, which was the premise. It's really about the book of Job, and Job and his whole plight of being a good person, but all these bad things happened to him. And then he relates it to Rabbi Kushner's 3-year-old son was diagnosed with a disease, and he died as a teenager. And this book was written, pardon me again, therapeutically, or to get his story out, comparing and trying to understand as a parent. Rabbi Harold Kushner is a great person. He does good things. He does mitzvot. He does the commandments. He does what they call midot. He follows Jewish values, moral and ethical. How could God do something this tragic to, you know, he's asking God, or he's asking someone, or the divinity, to answer the question of why my son had this at such a, he never got to live, and I never got to be his father for long enough. And I think that's a very powerful thing. And you know, even if you've been, I'm a 95-year-old person in one of my institutions that I work with, and he said to me a few weeks ago, he's like, you know, I survived the Holocaust. I did everything for my family, and you know, my kids have just kind of forgotten about me. And what you know, and I'm instead of living in my home in Brooklyn and enjoying the rest of my life, my final days or my final years, I'm here, you know, not being able to feed myself, not being able to move around as much, and, you know, sort of secluded in this institution, and not being in my home, which goes back to the question of home versus institution. He never feels the institution is his home. He feels it's a place where he's on the way to death. And why is this happening to me? And I think that is one of the toughest questions that we have to face, or we have to address, as the helpers, caregivers, if you will, is why is this happening? But then, and I'm going to piggyback on Dr. Miller's, the family will ask the same question. My mom was great. She was awesome. She's awesome. Why is this happening to her? Why do we have to go through this as a family? We're a good family. We're churchgoers. You know, we go to synagogue, we go to mosque, whatever it is. We're religious people. We're faith-based. We treat people with kindness. We give tzedakah. We give charity. Why is this happening to us? Why is this happening to her? And I think the biggest things are all these open-ended questions that are really hard to answer. And and part of the, maturity of someone who's the caregiver is to say, I'm not sure, I don't know, but to find some way of maybe turning around on them and finding a different way to, a more comforting way to look at the situation. Not a direct, sort of to redirect the question or redirect the situation to saying, oh, well, let's talk about all the wonderful things that you have done. This great life that you've led, these wonderful children that you have, these amazing grandchildren. I mean, there is, if you got the talent, you can really turn it around and make it where you can turn a really difficult question or difficult situation to a positive one.
That's good.
Doug, do you want to add something also?
I guess the one thing I would add is that sometimes we get so locked into the word trauma of thinking, a huge event, but we need to remember we're dealing with an individual and a family, and they have their own definition of trauma. And so
that's right.
Trauma may be, the house burning down, but it also may be the loss of a family pet. So we need to understand how they're using that term and what is trauma for them, and working with that trauma, as big or as small as it may be. And it's not only helping them with the question of, listening to them with the question of why, but giving a voice to what's going on, raising the lament. And I love the Hebrew scriptures of lamentation for when you're working with folks who are going through losses and traumas, sometimes people don't know that it's okay to pour out that kind of deep angst. And you read the scriptures of lamentation, and like, oh, I can do that. I can do that.
That's wonderful. Given permission to lament or given permission to celebrate.
I got two things to say about that. It's really interesting. So, sorry, it's interesting to me. So as I was listening to the question around why me, I was reminded of my own grandmother, who was a bilateral amputee after raising 13 children and making sure that she got them all through college. And she often said, because my mother, who's the baby, went through that whole thing. My grandmother was this wonderful person, blah, 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 blah. And it takes my grandmother to say, I need to stop you right now. And this is Black Christian women talking now. And her comment was, I had a wonderful life. And God, my Savior, put his son on the cross for me. Now, whatever you think about the Salvation Good Friday story is one set of conversations. But from a culture place, it is interesting to think through how do you contextualize part of these conversations. And there's a gospel writer, her name is Dorothy Norwood, and Dorothy Norwood, and she says a song, she said, Mercy That Suits. And she takes the text from Lamentations. I forget who the writer is, but for 19 verses, they complain. And then the 20th verse, there's something about, and then I recalled that God is the potter and I am the clay. And the potter can do whatever the potter wants to do with the clay. Now that's a whole mindset. And none of that's going to happen. That's 15 years of Sunday school and a whole bunch of other stuff. But all I'm saying about this is that culture has a huge role in this, right? And I think our role and our positionality in this is, again, and it's an interesting conversation. We talk about in the social work about partializing and normalizing. And so what is the explicit acute level work before us? And then what are the long range questions? And I think if we can help our clients to frame some of these things around the immediate, the mid-range, and the long range, I think that aligns in some ways with this notion of hope and making sense of what am I going to do tomorrow? Because you're not going to answer all this stuff right now, right? And you cannot squeeze 70 years of theology in 4 or 5 days. Well, you might. I'm not going to tell you what you can and can't do. But what I will say is this. If we can position our clients, again, to figure out in the moment where are available resolutions that give rise to the next moment in time, then it's that whole idea about step by step. I'm done.
Wow. Okay. Rabbi Ami, do you want to go on to question 5? It sounds like Dr. Miller is summarizing what we've talked about.
Absolutely. I think first and foremost, the question comes sometimes if it's pre the passing of the loved one is what's their legacy? What are they leaving behind? You can't take your money with you. It's really nice to be rich. It's really nice to be wealthy. It's really nice to have material things. But in Judaism, it's strongly, it really emphasizes your name. It's called a Shem Tov, having a good name. Who were you? What were you all about? What did you leave behind? When people are doing the eulogy, what are they saying about you? Is a rabbi in a very difficult position having to say nice things about someone and sort of fudge it about someone who really wasn't that nice and didn't do that great? Or are they really getting deep and profound? And it's really easy to tell the community, this person was just a pillar. They were wonderful. They were giving. They were caring. They were sweet. So I think that's one. In the Jewish religion, for those who don't know, and I've been told this by priests and people of other religions, is they say Jews seem to do it the right way. I don't know if that's true or not true, but as someone who's experienced in this in a lot of ways, personally and professionally, is the process after someone passes away is called a shiva, and shiva is from the word shiva, which is 7. So you mourn for 7 days after the person is officially buried. Once they're buried, you mourn for 7 days, and you don't do anything. You're in your home or the home of where the person lived, and you sit on sort of shorter seats, and people cater to you. You don't greet them; they don't greet you. What you do, there are certain words that you say of comfort, and that shiva process is really an immediate process to give time for people to heal, for people to pay their respects, for people to, and the best part, and the thing I like most, is that, and it goes back to what Dr. Miller said before, a couple questions ago, was it's an opportunity for the mourners to tell the story of their loved one. It's storytelling. I mean, if you want to write a great storytelling book, go to a shiva once. I'm serious. Go to a shiva and find out about what some of these most dynamic people you'll ever hear about, and what they did, and who they helped without anybody knowing it. When my mom passed away, my brother and I found out stories about mom we had no clue about, of ways she impacted other people. Some of our really close friends that we grew up with, she impacted, and they told stories we had no idea about until that shiva, and how wonderful, it made us feel a sense of pride and feel a sense of even more awesome. My mom was already brilliant and terrific and a great person, but it enhanced, and it was very comforting to know that my mom had such an incredible impact. So I think the shiva process and the way the community comes together, and I'll leave it on this, that in Judaism, when someone passes away, there's a certain prayer that you say. It's called Kaddish Yatom, and what's interesting is the wording they use. Yatom means orphan, because the idea was that the rabbis never thought losing a child that would happen so often, but the idea is that you're a child who's lost a parent, and so in hindsight, or figuratively, literally, you're an orphan. You have no parent anymore. Of course, you might have another parent, etc., that has not passed, but the idea is that you've lost a parent. So they call it Kaddish Yatom, the orphanage, Kaddish, or the holiness, and it's and it's not about death. If you read the Kaddish Yatom, or you say the Kaddish Yatom, it's not about death at all. It's about what's based on a line. Someone will correct me if I'm wrong, from the Talmud, or from Torah, actually. It's Adonai Natan, Adonai Lakach, Yehi Shem Adonai Mevorach. God gives life, God takes life, and we bless God for giving us that life in the first place. The body never belonged to us. It's on layaway. It's on layaway, right, Dr. Miller?
That's hot.
Okay.
That's hot. That's hot.
Okay. God gives life, God takes life, and we bless God. That's what the Kaddish Yatom, that the whole essence of it is. We thank God for this opportunity, that God is so majestic. That's why we use all these things of the image of God as King, and saying thank you to God for giving us this opportunity in the first place.
Thank you, Rabbi Ami. That was very meaningful. Doug, would you like to summarize before we open it for the Q&A?
Well, I was, as I was listening to Rabbi, I was thinking, you're talking about the very Jewish culture and ritual that helps facilitate good grief within that culture. I think every culture, every faith group has a ritual. And, for us as providers, one of the richest experiences and one of the most important experiences is helping to facilitate those rituals, sometimes just right immediately at the moment of death. Maybe it's, it's a prayer of commendation. Maybe it is, I think of an opportunity I had to be with a Buddhist family at time of death and the ritual. Those rituals, when they are facilitated, when we can help promote them, when we can help encourage them or provide opportunity for them, or simply tell, if a person's in a facility, get out of the way so the family can do what they need to do, contributes to the long-term well-being of that family following the death, because they can look back at the moment of death and say, the ritual was done. I can be at peace. The ritual was done.
Yes.
I got 2 words and then I'll stop. One of them, and they're actually tied together. And this idea about, first of all, Doug, good grief. That's fabulous. That's number one. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. I want to talk a little bit about this construct of reconciliation and reconstitution, because here's what's, and so my father died the August before I defended my dissertation, and that November was Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving was a big deal in our house, and I remember I was in New City, and a friend of mine said, "Go take your seat, your rightful seat at the table." Well, I'm going back to the chair I've been sitting in since I was 6. Leave me alone. And the commentary is, no. The seats around the dining room table have changed. And yours is now at the head of the table. Well, that gave me pause and almost gave me indigestion. And then I thought, nah, I'm gonna eat a macaroni and cheese. But here's the point. The issue on the floor is we are in the passing of the loved one. There's lots of language for it. The strong tower has fallen, a library has burned to the ground. However you frame it, but we've got to reconstitute ourselves in the current reality. And to the extent that we can process our grief, I think it goes a long way to this notion of how we are able to reconcile the task of reconstitution. And so whatever helps us get there, the 7 days of Shiva, the wake and the funeral, all those things, right? And here's the point, and everybody already knows this. For the aftermath of the service, when everybody else goes away, then what are you left with? When you feel the absence so acutely, that's where the real work happens. And that's where, and I don't know, because I don't do grief, I don't do grief work. I've not done hospice work in that way. But there is something, I think one of the tasks at hand before we take our leave as providers around, a tour guide thing is kind of odd. But how do you help them begin to plan for the immediate, the mid-range, and the long term? And part of that is, and again, and this is particularly with elderly couples who've been married 5, 6 decades. And there is this thing, if we can get the spouse through the first year of the passing, chances are they're going to be okay. But they got to get through that year. And that year takes a lot because, I mean, the biochemistry and the musculature and physiology and anatomy tell us that there is such a thing as dying of a broken heart. And it's a stress on the cardiovascular walls that begin to fray. And I don't know all the terminology for it, but you get the point. That stress shows up in the heart muscle. And so the work becomes, how do we as providers help the family to be attentive to the various stressors post-death in the service of hope? Because the point of the matter is, for those for whom it does, life goes on. I'm done.
Anybody else wants to comment on the service of hope or being a volunteer?
Well, I just want to say that I think one of the things that's been most important in my experience, which goes, I think, on the same line as Dr. Miller, is the idea of it's not all of a sudden the person's coming back after the shiva, or after the funeral, after the wake.
Right.
People forget about that family, or that
Right.
it doesn't just go away all of a sudden.
That's right.
Those, to me, the biggest heroes, and I'm not taking away anything from anybody who's coming to the funeral, coming to the wake, going to the shiva, if they're there every day. More power to them. God bless them. They're doing a huge mitzvah. They're doing great commandments. Okay. But there is afterwards.
That's right.
And it might not be a half a year or 10 years.
That's right.
I have friends who have lost parents who are still, they lost their parents 15 years ago, and they still feel the effects of it all the time. Every time we have to remember that the life cycle events, the Jewish life cycle events, are just reminders of who is not there. One of the best things that, at least in my experience with rabbis, is when they acknowledge those who are not present at b'nai bar and bat mitzvahs, at weddings, etc. All this celebratory occasions, they don't, though the good rabbis, and I will say that very strongly, are the ones that don't forget the people who aren't there and who aren't present, because they were the ones who set the tone to get to that day.
That's right.
They were the builders.
That's right.
To get to that day.
That's right.
And I think, and it also gives those who are thinking about it, which a lot of people are, you know, when my nephew's bar mitzvah happened, all I could think of was that my mom wasn't there. And it gave me comfort to when the rabbi acknowledged my mom's presence, and that how proud she would have been of my nephew and all that. That, like, we have to remember there's life after those immediate, I hate to use this word, but remedies for after someone has passed, or ways of trying to heal within the community. There's the aftermath. So that's why it's important. One of the things I do is I always make calls to people after Shiva, the weeks after, and I just say, hey, how are you? I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing. And the more caregivers that, and priests, rabbis, imams, whatever, do that, you know, pastoral caregivers, the more they do that, the more powerful their healing and help can be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Rabbi Ami. We have about 10 minutes left. So if you have a question that hasn't been asked yet, please put it in the chat box. And we're going to give a microphone to Doug to summarize. Any final words of wisdom? Doug or Dr. Miller, Rabbi Ami?
I was reminded of this idea about checking in. So I had at least 3 cousins who perished in the towers in 9/11. And one was like president of Massachusetts. And Teddy Kennedy would send a remembrance card every year after 9/11. And it was, I don't think my aunts, I'm sure my aunt voted for Teddy, but she certainly didn't know Teddy, and Teddy didn't know her as that, but he just made the effort. And when I talk about this idea of reconciliation or reconstitution, I think Rabbi makes a point. If you are able to engage the subsequent ministry of presence, that aids in the reconciliation and the reconstitution. And again, it's that high, it is that high, because death is powerful. Death is powerful. And once again, I think we have to make, I think not only do we have to make intentional decisions around choosing life, but I think we are also called in our roles to support the life invitation.
Thank you. Doug, do you want to add something to that?
I just saw a pop-up on a chat that said, and if we're totally present, it doesn't matter if we're serving someone of a different faith. Very much true, very much true. Because it's about being present. It's
Sure.
about being with that person where they are in their own journey. I think we've said it before. It's not about me, it's about them, and it's about being with them. Without going into details, I can just think of opportunities where it's been transcultural, it's been transfaith, and you can see the results of that being present with folks in their face, in their words, as those moments draw to a close. And then, I'll leave it there. That whole idea of presence is so powerful.
Rabbi Ami, when you started, you talked about providing a whole and safe and comfortable place for the person who is not well and the family.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like we almost made a circle talking about our presence, and that presence being that opportunity to provide safety to the family, to grieve at their own pace, with their own rituals, and to really support them throughout, immediate, during, after, and on the longitudinal scale. Does anybody else have any questions? We're coming to a close. Any final comments?
One of the things I would say is that that's in relation to the question that was in the chat was, I think one of the things, because Dr. Miller and Doug were both saying this, that the provider, the person that's providing the, the help or the healing or whatever you want to call it, the caregiver, they need to do their homework. I don't know how any other way to put it, but you need to do your homework in terms of it doesn't matter what religion is. I mean, you should know what religion, or that they're not tied to a religion at all. I think that's really important to know and to understand, both so you don't make a faux pas, but also so you understand where they're coming from. Because if someone is, religiously Catholic, there's a lot of different rules and a lot of different ways of looking at things that are very different from Judaism, and especially in the Muslim world as well. And you want to be that one of the things we actually didn't talk about as much is that sensitivity to not only the religion, but the situation in all aspects of the game. Like, we don't know that much, as we said before, we don't know a lot about Donna's background. We had basic information, but, age, what the trauma was, did the interracial marriage, what town were it doesn't say what town. Did the interracial marriage, tee off some people? Did it make it for an uncomfortable situation? Was that the trauma? Was that the trauma? I was thinking about that. In this day and age, I wouldn't think about it as a trauma by any means, but maybe they were in a community that was all white, or they were a community that's all black, and they're an interracial couple, and their kids had to go through a lot of difficult times, and because of the decision they made to get together because of love over, thinking about themselves as a race. And just, I think it's really just, and this goes also with grief. One of the things that I love that I know, I'm pretty sure priests do, and I know rabbis do this because I've done it myself, is when you're doing a funeral, you sit with the family
Right.
for an hour or 2 hours, and you
Right.
get to know the details about the person. Obviously, especially if you didn't know the person,
Right.
which happens 85% of the time, you get a whole rundown of who that person was, so you can formulate what you're going to say in the eulogy or how you're going to conduct the funeral. Well, that's doing your homework. That's getting to know what the person was all about, so you can speak about them in the kindest way. Even if they weren't a good person, if you're good, you can find a way to twist it to make them, like a really good person. And I saw it happen when we lived in California. I was at a funeral where I knew the person wasn't such a great person. He had done some really bad things, but the rabbi really impressively twisted around to make him look decent. And it may not be the most kosher way of doing things, but but it is, but there is something really important about doing your homework and finding out what that person really loved and touching upon that. Oh, I know that person was a huge fan of Emily Dickinson. Well, here's a beautiful poem I'd like to bring to the family to read in front of her, to give her some peace and comfort, or to read Emily Dickinson at the funeral. That just those kinds of things I think are really important in doing your homework.
I want to say one thing around that, Rami, because Rabbi Ami.
Yes, that's my new name is Rami.
Rami.
It's actually Rabbi Ami, but both you and Tanya I'm now Rabbi Rami.
Rami.
I like to be just called Rami. It's fine.
There you go, Rami. So the only thing I would say to that is understand what homework really means, right? Because at the end of the day, you could, I'll say it more succinctly. It seems to me the most significant action that we as providers can do is to solicit the story. Because what we're learning, and the reality is, storytelling is a process of how a person crafts meaning for an event. And that issue is, I think we're poorly served if we think to the point, and it's a genius question, Gail Spada, if I said just certain, mostly because, first of all, we're not going to know everything about anything. That's number one. Number two, I'm not quite sure that's where the best time is spent. It seems to me if we can ask the generative questions so that the person can tell us their understanding of the event, that teaches us plenty, because first of all, it makes the person feel seen. It reshapes a dynamic to make the person the expert and we are the learner. And it also really helps us, if we're careful listeners, that's when we don't get it wrong. As opposed to, because your point, you don't have to, whatever Buddhism means to one person, I'm the guy who is both Black, Catholic, and Baptist in some ways, and has a long AME tradition. Trying to figure out what all that stuff means for me is far more, because I don't think about it that much, right? I think the larger point is what's important for the person who's walking this journey. And again, for me, the key words are intentional witness and understanding how that plays into the ministry of presence. And if we can frame those questions that position us to be the witness bearers, I think we've done our work.
Amen.
Well, I see it is coming up around that 4:30. So I just want to say a huge thank you to every one of our speakers this afternoon who provided us with a wealth of information, and I'm sure lots of things to think about. And I just want to let everybody know that our next presentation or program will be on Tuesday, October 26th. It's entitled Making Your Wishes Known, Difficult Conversations About End of Life. We hope you all have a great rest of your day. And again, as we mentioned before, the recording will hopefully be up on LifePath's website in the upcoming weeks. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, panelists.
Yeah,
Terrific.
and I want to thank Kristen and Felicia for facilitating this. This has been
Lovely.
This has been great. This has been great. We need to do more of this kind of thing.
Well,
Amen.
Doug, you're terrific. And Rami, I found a new friend.
Thank you, Doug and Dr. Miller. Appreciate it.
thank you, everyone.
Felicia,
You all be
Tanya,
well.
thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
good care. Bye-bye.
Take care.